Although it's said that the truth always surfaces, nobody anticipated that Angie Stone's own son would reveal something shocking that would leave fans stunned. Her son finally broke down after weeks of silence after her unexpected death, revealing startling autopsy results that totally defy the official narrative. What was Angie Stone's actual fate, and why was the world informed that her death was merely a terrible mishap? The secrets surrounding her last moments are more unsettling than anyone could have predicted, so stay tuned. There was no denying Angie Stone's musical legacy. Soul, R&B, and neo-soul powerhouse, who made a lasting impression with heartfelt songs. However, her untimely passing has now raised issues that nobody anticipated. Although official reports stated that she died in an accident, her own son believes that to be completely untrue. Her son Michael has come forward with previously unheard-of details from Angie's autopsy, and what he discovered alters everything in a devastating and shocking revelation. We'll explore Angie Stone's true story in today's film, as well as how her son learned these startling truths and why the music industry would have intended this information to be permanently hidden. You will learn about Angie's years-long battles, betrayals, and conflicts, as well as how they all relate to her premature passing. There are many surprises in this story, some of which could permanently alter your perception of Angie Stone's legacy and career, so stay tuned until the very end. Angie Stone was accustomed to hardship and perseverance. Angie had fought for her music, her legacy, and her family throughout her life, from her early days as a hip-hop pioneer with the Sequins to her rise to fame as a neo-soul legend in the early 2000s. However, those closest to her said that something felt strange in her last days. Angie was regarded by close friends as emotionally and physically exhausted due to the toll that personal betrayals, health problems, and industry disputes had caused. Nevertheless, she was renowned for her strength and frequently dismissed worries, ready to keep working even if it meant taxing herself to the limit. According to the official account made public, Angie's death was determined to be an unintentional medical event, potentially related to her pre-existing medical conditions, such as excessive blood pressure and diabetes. However, her son Michael, who had supported her during many of her most trying times, couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't quite right. In the weeks leading up to her death, friends had observed odd happenings, missed calls, postponed appointments, and a growing feeling of Angie's paranoia. She even thought her phone was being tapped, according to some, and that someone was pursuing her. Most people dismissed it as stress at the time, but after her passing, those minor details began to portray a far worse picture. Michael claims that the night before she died, Angie confided in him that she was afraid for her life as well as her career. She made a suggestion that others in the business wanted her to be quiet, particularly after she started to speak out against abuse, backdoor dealings, and royalty theft that cost her millions of dollars. Angie vanished less than 24 hours later. However, this is where the situation becomes much more disturbing. As soon as Michael saw her official autopsy report for the first time, he saw a number of anomalies that didn't fit the unintentional story that was provided to the public. What were these anomalies, and why did Michael believe that his mother's death was anything than an accident? Keep reading, because we'll go into the autopsy details that made all the difference and why Michael thinks someone wanted Angie gone in the next section. Angie Stone's family anticipated a simple post-mortem procedure when her body was brought in for a standard check. After all, Angie had a history of severe weight swings, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes, among other chronic health conditions, which made her more susceptible to unexpected health problems. However, something caught her attention right away when her son Michael sat down to go over the initial results. Information that didn't fit the usual pattern of a natural death brought on by heart failure or a diabetic crisis. Michael claims that there were several inconsistencies in the chronology of her death, and that there were also unidentified trauma indicators that aroused grave concerns. For instance, because of Angie's well-known health issues, the official cause of death was first listed as cardiac arrest associated with diabetic problems. The toxicological report, however, provided a different account. Her blood contained traces of sedatives and an unidentified medication for which Angie had no prescription. Michael, who who had been in charge of much of her medical treatment, was aware of all of his mother's prescriptions. Angie had not been prescribed any of these foreign substances, but he was troubled by other things as well. They were bruised, not the kind you might anticipate from a straightforward mishap or tumble. She had deep tissue bruises on her neck, wrists, and upper arms, among other places. These bruises were consistent with someone being aggressively restrained, the type of force necessary to subdue someone actively resisting, according to a forensic expert Michael contacted. Angie told Michael, "I feel like someone's watching me," in a talk with him a few days before she passed away. "Every time I raise my voice, something occurs. A trade falls through, a contract vanishes, or I receive a warning call advising me to stay in my lane." Michael believed at the time that his mother was simply expressing her annoyance at her continuous legal disputes with previous management teams and labels, who had supposedly refused to pay royalties for her best hits, which laid the groundwork for contemporary neo-soul and even hip-hop. However, after observing the anomalies in the autopsy, he began to think that Angie's paranoia wasn't actually paranoia. It was an indication that she was being kept quiet. The speed at which the official reports were sealed and the lack of media coverage of Angie's true cause of death raised even more questions. It was as though someone wanted the story to be forgotten before it became popular. In an attempt to find out more, Michael engaged a private pathologist. At that point, the situation became even more dire. What Michael dreaded most was validated by this independent investigation. In addition to evidence of airway congestion that was not consistent with natural causes, Angie's body displayed signs of extended stress and potential asphyxia. To put it another way, even if someone may have purposefully stopped her breathing, the final public report nevertheless declared her death to be due to natural causes. Michael thinks this decision was made in response to pressure from influential industry people who wanted Angie to go. Her tail was buried, and her voice was suppressed. However, who specifically would desire Angie Stone's death? And what secrets might have been so near to being revealed that her life was taken to prevent her from speaking? The enemies Angie created over the years, the influential music executives who benefited from her efforts, and the troubling trend of stifling vocal black artists who stand up for their rights will all be covered in the next segment. Angie Stone's talent was evident to those who knew her personally. However, she was also unafraid to speak her mind, even if it caused discomfort to influential people. Angie was more than just a vocalist. She was a woman who was aware of the inner workings of the music business and didn't hesitate to expose the murky backroom transactions, exploitation, and greed that many artists, especially black women, had to deal with. Her later years did not mark the beginning of her outspokenness. Her DNA had always contained it. Angie was outspoken about how the industry disenfranchised women like her from the time she left the hip-hop group Sequence to become the queen of neo-soul. Women who didn't conform to the stereotypical ideal of slender, fair-skinned pop divas. She didn't merely discuss it in private. She also created songs, conducted interviews, and even confronted executives in private. One of the most notorious events occurred in the early 2000s when Angie accused her record label in public of not paying royalties for her most successful albums. Almost immediately, she was banned from certain radio stations. However, Angie continued to defy expectations even after that. Rather, she grew even more outspoken, particularly on the financial exploitation of black female musicians, who frequently signed exploitative contracts that left them broke even after selling millions of records. Because of her willingness to reveal these tactics, Angie became a target for the whole music industry's power structure, not just the label executives. Close pals claimed that Angie had been warned via anonymous phone calls to cut back on her talking and to keep in mind who controls the airways. She initially dismissed it, believing it to be nothing more than vacuous threats from irate former co-workers. However, as she continued to speak out, more transactions began to suddenly fall through. Her records would vanish from streaming services without warning, and tour sponsors would abruptly withdraw, and partners would drop out of projects out of fear of being linked to someone the industry viewed as a problem. However, this is where things became more sinister. According to reports, Angie was writing a candid memoir in the months before her passing that would have revealed the innermost thoughts and feelings of some of the most influential people in music. Michael claims that his mother had contracts, emails, invoices, and audio recordings of discussions that showed sexual pressure, plots, and even threats of violence against artists who disobeyed. The book was never released. Even more unsettling is the fact that Michael discovered manuscript drafts on Angie's laptop, although they lacked numerous crucial chapters, especially the ones in which she specifically mentioned people and businesses. It seemed as though the most incriminating details of her story had been purposefully removed before anyone could see them. And it wasn't just Michael who saw something strange. According to a number of Angie's closest friends and associates, she appeared more nervous than normal in the weeks leading up to her passing. She talked about strange automobiles parked outside her house, people she didn't know attending her performances, and getting texts from numbers she didn't know telling her to keep quiet for her own sake. Angie was threatened with legal action if her book was ever published, according to a former label executive who wished to stay nameless. They also alluded to the possibility of silencing those who are unsure of when to give up. The fact that Angie was by no means the first artist to experience this kind of intimidation just serves to heighten the unease. The music industry has a long and unpleasant history of penalizing musicians who don't play the game, from Prince's struggle for masters ownership to TLC's financial struggles. However, Angie's situation seems distinct. Serious concerns are raised by the combination of her unexplained injuries, the sealed autopsy report, and the abrupt loss of her most damaging evidence. Did she really die from natural causes, or was it the final cost of criticizing the system? After his mother passed away, Michael investigated her affairs further and discovered a disturbing trend. A network of influence that spanned major labels, publishing houses, and even mainstream media sources was formed by some of the people who had previously collaborated on her court battles, her cancelled deals, and her missing income. Angie had been the most recent victim of a pattern of silencing that had evolved from a notion. The tale doesn't stop there though, because Angie's son Michael isn't going to let her narrative die, even though her voice may have been hushed. Regardless of how strong her adversaries may be, he has been compiling witness accounts, digital data, and paper documents in an effort to ultimately reveal the truth about what transpired with his mother. One last piece of the puzzle must be put in place before Michael can reveal this industry-wide plot. Who the enigmatic visitor who came to see Angie in her last hours was, someone whose role in her demise could hold the secret to everything. And in the following section, we will discover precisely that. The last visit. On the night of Angie's death, who was in her house? The official account of the night Angie Stone was discovered unconscious was incredibly straightforward. It's almost too easy. She had supposedly slipped and sustained serious injuries in a strange accident. According to the original account, her fall-related problems were promptly identified as the cause of death. They described it as a horrible accident. The case is over. However, the information that Michael Stone discovered following the death of his mother presented a much more complicated and gruesome picture. One item sparked unsettling inquiries regarding who and why had visited Angie's house that evening. You see, even while Angie was hardly a recluse in her last months, she was cautious about who she allowed into her personal space. After a string of disturbing events, threatening threats, and illegal attempts to access her private email, friends claim she had become more defensive, and even odd people that seemed to be watching her house while lurking around her area. Angie's closest friends and family claim that she had a hunch that someone was attempting to silence her, particularly when her candid memoir was almost finished. Michael therefore anticipated seeing either a break-in or nothing out of the ordinary when he watched the security camera footage from his mother's house. Instead, he discovered something much darker. The night before Angie was discovered, at around 11:47 p.m., a black luxury SUV came up outside her house. The driver never got out, but a man in all black, who was a passenger, came up to the front door.
After a lengthy talk over the intercom, this man, who never looked straight into the camera, was buzzed inside the residence. This in itself was strange. It was late at night, and Angie was not in the habit of welcoming strangers into her house. The fact that this man stayed inside the house for almost 2 hours before leaving just after 1:30 a.m. was much more disturbing. Who was he? And why would Angie, who was being extremely cautious in her last days, allow him inside, then hold him there for an extended period? Michael started researching, consulting Angie's private notebook, which she had meticulously maintained for many years. A week before she passed away, a terrifying entry was hidden within pages of lyrics, introspection, and notes for her memoir. He reached out again, and it read, "He claims he wants to make things clear. Something feels off after all these years, but before I share my story, I need to find closure. I'll let him in, but only if he doesn't lie anymore." Although the entry did not identify the person, it was sufficient to validate Michael's worst suspicion. That night's visitor to his mother wasn't just any friend or business associate. Someone with unresolved business from her past was there. Why is this even more sinister? Is that, just days before she passed away, Angie told a close friend that she was feeling pressed to change or dilute certain aspects of her narrative. In particular, the parts that list prominent business leaders connected to financial exploitation, pay-for-play schemes, and even allegations of sexual coercion against female performers. Angie and an unidentified legal consultant exchanged dozens of emails which Michael discovered. Someone who said that if her book disclosed too much they might assist shield her from lawsuits. But a few days before she passed away, those emails took a dark turn. The ultimate takeaway was that certain tales are better left spoken. People are observing, people are standing by. For your own protection, kindly think again. Was the man that came to see Angie that evening a messenger trying to intimidate her into keeping quiet, or did he represent something much worse? A housekeeper, sent to make sure her tale would never be heard outside of those four walls. Michael has a mission to discover. He located nearby residents and inquired whether anyone had seen the SUV or knew who the unknown guest was. An older neighbor recalled seeing the car, but Michael shuddered at what she said next. She remembered the man leaving the home with a small black bag in his hand, gloves on, and the cool accuracy of someone who had done this before. This visit was not social, it was a mission. When Michael got a copy of the official police report, he found something even more concerning. First responders said that Angie had voluntarily allowed someone inside the house because the front door was unlocked when they got there, and there were no indications of forced entry. Here's the twist though. The security tape Michael looked at did not fit the timeline of events provided to authorities by the industry insider who initially reported Angie's death. This individual stated that they hadn't communicated with Angie for a few days before to her death. However, just hours before the mysterious visitor arrived, Michael discovered a deleted phone call log that revealed a 34-minute conversation between Angie and that same insider. What was talked about on that call? For what reason was it removed? Furthermore, why would someone fabricate a story regarding their most recent conversation with Angie Stone? There's more. Michael noticed discrepancies in the autopsy images that were not consistent with a straightforward slip-and-fall mishap. Some internal injuries, abrasions and bruises were more typical of blunt force trauma, which is the type brought on by intentional physical aggression, not a domestic mishap.